Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Gelb, and I would like to welcome you all to the 6th installment of ConMaciel Carey's OSHA 2020 OSHA webinar series. OSHA's PPE standards, the top 5 reasons to get it right, and the top 5 employer mistakes. We're glad that you all are taking time to join us, whether it's live today or on a recording, whatever that fits your schedule best. And we hope that this will be an informative and practical discussion about why compliance with OSHA's PPE standard is vitally important, as well as the mistakes we see many employers make that result in citations and fines. When we went through our annual webinar planning process late last year, the group quickly reached a consensus that personal protective equipment, or PPE, was a topic that merited special attention in 2020 because of the integral role it plays in an effective workplace safety program, and because we had not devoted an entire webinar to that topic in quite some time. Although we have covered various PPE requirements and other programs throughout the years, including most recently as our electrical safety webinar last fall. We never imagined, obviously, that PPE would become something of a vital concern, not only to a subset of general industry employers, but really for the entire population of this country, such that office workers, cashiers, restaurant employees, people who never probably gave a second thought to PPE are now wearing filtering face pieces, debating the differences between N95s and KN95s, talking about face shields. So this COVID-19 pandemic has obviously thrust PPE front and center, as it's something that employees expect, but also that employers, many of you all, I imagine, are now either partially or entirely unable to find. There are plenty of articles out there talking about the challenges that employers face, the increased costs, and as the economy moves along the path towards reopening, broader reopening, PPE is likely going to remain difficult, if not certain types impossible to find, as employers struggle to figure out a balance between the types of PPE that you all need, what must be done to select the right types, provide them, train your employees on their use, and figuring out how can you safely reopen if you can't get all those types of PPE. So with that, let's begin with some brief introductions. Again, my name is Aaron Gelb, and I lead the firm's Midwest OSHA practice. I devote the overwhelming balance of my practice to dealing with federal and state OSHA investigations, inspections, litigating and contesting citations. Spend a bulk of my time here in Region 5 dealing with OSHA inspections, state plan inspections, so federal OSHA in Illinois, state plan states in Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, federal inspections in Ohio as well. Significant time, obviously, with the 5 Illinois area offices. I've had quite an interesting experience since the pandemic started in the last 3 months. Defended a Zoom inspection before OSHA stopped using or allowing Zoom, a couple of drone inspections, and what I'm told is the first in-person factory inspection here in Region 5 since early or mid-March. So with that, I'll let Micah and Dan introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Micah Smith. I'm a partner in the DC office of ConMaciel Carey in the OSHA Workplace Safety Practice Group. I've represented employers in a wide range of industries all across the country, small matters, large matters, from the opening of OSHA inspections all the way through the litigation process, through trials and appeals, and of course we provide counsel to employers before OSHA ever shows up, hopefully identifying issues and resolving problems before there's an enforcement problem. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be talking about PPE today. Dan?
Thanks, Micah. My name is Dan Deacon, and I'm an associate in the DC office of ConMaciel Carey. I actually work in both the OSHA and labor and employment groups, and I do pretty much everything that walks through the door, representing employers during Fed OSHA and state OSHA inspections and investigations, and I assist in the full range of litigation related to citations and notices of appeal, and I advise and counsel employers on a wide range of wage and hour issues, discrimination, and everything that deals with the employer-employee relationship. and I am often tasked with reviewing and revising employee handbooks, workplace safety policies and procedures, and the like. And as of recent, we've been doing a lot of that as it relates to PPE and COVID-19. So looking forward to an interesting discussion today about that. And I'll turn it back over to Aaron to go over the agenda.
Thanks, Dan. And as I mentioned at the top of the program, we're going to start by focusing on what we think, based on our past experiences, as well as the current experiences during the pandemic, what are the top 5 reasons why PPE matters, and why this is something that when you're really kind of prioritizing things, you can make this a top agenda item in your own safety program. Then we're going to look at the 5 most common PPE-related mistakes, and really that is what kind of is driven by the frequency with which various sections or types of PPE violations are alleged by OSHA in the form of citations. Then the at least semi-recent addition to the agenda, certainly not one that was contemplated back when we put this program up together back late last year, the PPE implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, and hopefully we'll leave enough time for some questions and answers at the end of the program. So moving on, jumping right into to prioritize PPE. The first one, is really that PPE requirements are everywhere. We'll specifically about the PPE standard itself, but not all requirements or elements of PPE are covered just in 1910-132. Depending on the nature of your operations, the types of tasks that are performed within your workplaces, there are a host of standards that cover and address PPE. Some which deal with the specific types of PPE, the requirements that go with them, as well as different types of work, different types of hazards that are addressed through other standards that have within them sections dealing with PPE. So 1910-94 deals with abrasive blasting, and there's a section within that standard that deals with the type of PPE that should be provided. As you can see through the most of the rest of the slide, there's a specifics. Obviously, everyone's presumably familiar with the hearing protection standard 1910-95, which has, of course, a section on hearing protectors. Then you've got the specific types of PPE addressed in the standards 1910-133 for eye protection, 134, which obviously is top of mind to many of you right now, respiratory protection, the types of respirators that would typically be provided or required in certain workplaces when there's exposure to whether it's high levels of dust or hazardous chemicals, the various types in terms of how you select and evaluate those. We're going to deal with that particularly in detail a little bit later in the COVID section of the webinar. There's then 1910-135 deals with protecting the head, 136 deals with foot protection, 138 deals with hands. Then you've got, obviously, as I referenced earlier, a little bit earlier, 1910-137, electrical protective equipment, part of the electrical safety webinar we did last year. 140, not certainly a big focus for OSHA, fall protection in 1910-140. There's a section on PPE that provide the types of PPE that should be provided to folks on the rescue team for permit required confined spaces in 1910-146. And then last but not least, and there are others, 1910-253, which deals with welding and cutting and brazing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I believe, to Micah to talk about a couple of other reasons. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. And I've covered this. Again, the PPE comes in a variety of forms. Much of it kind of deals with either the types of hazard or the parts of the body that need protection. And I believe I've covered most of these in the prior slide, but certainly, number 6, fire retardant clothing and other protective clothing for certain types of workplaces is another piece that you need to pay attention to. And again, hand and eye, head and face, foot protection, hearing protection. So certainly the overarching theme is a lot of requirements that deal with PPE, a lot that you need to be familiar with. And Micah's going to talk a little bit about the PPE standard itself, 1910-132 now.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, that's a great intro to the second reason to get PPE right. It's actually, it's not just that it has its own standard. PPE is its own subpart in OSHA's general industry standards. Subpart I contains all of these elements here. There are separate provisions related to most of the different types of PPE that Aaron was discussing just now. So it's really important to make sure that you dig in and you get it right, and that you get an understanding of how this subpart of the standards work. And I wanted to give you a quick overview while talking through this slide here. Browsing the table of contents of the subpart doesn't necessarily illuminate how you ought to read them. So we wanted to start here with 1910-132. This is the introductory part. This is what introduces you to PPE and the requirements there. It contains there in 1910-132A the baseline requirement to provide personal protective equipment to employees. It says that you have to provide protective equipment when it is protective equipment for all these different categories of things. That you have to provide it, use it, and maintain it in a sanitary and reliable condition wherever it is necessary by reason of hazards. And there's a long list of the hazards that may make it necessary and that you can get into, and they'll relate to different portions. But that's the basic requirement here. You have to provide protective equipment. You have to require its use, and you have to do that whenever it's necessary. So this may be one of OSHA's broadest requirements. It's only slightly more narrow than the general duty clause that just says you have to maintain a sort of safe workplace. But it's in that same vein. It says it's up to you to go ahead and do the assessment to find out when you need protective equipment and to go out and provide it. Here on this slide, we've included some of the major elements, and this is in 132. It's going to tell you some information about what design the PPE has to be, again, in a very general way. It contains the requirement that you perform your own hazard assessment, that you go out and actively identify where you are going to need personal protective equipment. There's some information here about what training you have to provide, what you have to do when there is defective or damaged PPE, and who has to pay for it. We're going to dig down a little bit deeper into those, but as we move on to the next slide, we wanted to identify how PPE is a cooperative effort between employers and employees. As you can see here, we've identified the responsibilities of the employer on the left and the responsibilities of the employees. It's worth noting that, of course, as with all OSHA standards, OSHA can't cite employees for violations of OSHA standards. They can only cite employers. So while we have broken out the responsibilities between employer and employees, it's important to know as a manager or a supervisor that it's up to you to ensure that the employees are living up to their responsibilities under the PPE standard. So I wanted to highlight that early on. But here we've got the outline of what you have to do and how you're going to interact with the PPE standard. As we've said before, step one is assess your workplace for hazards, determine when and where PPE has to be used. You have to provide and pay for the PPE. There's a big asterisk there. We'll cover a little bit later in this presentation when you don't have to pay for things that look like PPE and a few categories of PPE that you don't have to pay for. But generally speaking, you're going to provide and pay for PPE. You're going to provide training to employees. And then that last bullet here on the slide is ensure the PPE is properly used, inspected, and maintained. That transitions you over to the employee responsibility. So it's up to the employer to ensure that the employee obligations are met. And we've got that list there. To properly use it, inspect it daily, maintain it in clean, reliable condition, and notify the employer when it's damaged or ineffective and such that it needs to be replaced. So it's a big PPE requirements. It is a big set of requirements, but if you start small, you start with this simple framework, that's going to get you a long way to understanding where you're going and what responsibilities you have there. So I'll pass it over to Dan for our reason number 3.
Great, thanks, Micah. So reason number 3 that compliance with this PPE standard and the myriad of issues and requirements under that standard is it's often cited. And as you can see here, we have a variety of the different regulations and sub-provisions of the PPE standard that depict how many times they have been cited within the past fiscal year. And if you start from the top, we have 1910-132 subsection D2, and that's for lack of verification of a PPE hazard assessment or no hazard assessment at all, D1, and that comprises a majority of the PPE related citations under 1910-132. We're looking at approximately 580 or so, 585 total citations issued last fiscal year related to PPE hazard assessments alone. Going down the list, continuing down the list, 1910-132A, again, that's the general application provision, which can be cited in a myriad of different scenarios, and that's for either not providing PPE at all or not providing adequate PPE. You can find yourself under that sub-provision in, again, a myriad or a number of different ways, and that was cited quite a number of times as well, 173. And then as we continue down the line, we have a number of citations related to the primary tenets that Micah just went over a couple slides ago, related to training, not selecting PPE, and providing PPE at no cost to the employee. So moving on to the next slide, reason number 4 that it's important to get the PPE standard right is that you can face per employee citations. So this was back about 12 years ago. OSHA proposed and issued a final rule allowing employers who violate the PPE standard to be penalized on a per employee basis. And we have the citation to the Federal Register in that final rule if you want to go and take a further look at that, but we'll give you the basics here. And that's, each time an employee is found to be inadequately trained or does not have the proper PPE, if an OSHA inspector shows up and sees that perhaps 5 employees are not wearing PPE, there is the potential that you can be cited 5 separate times, a per employee citation final rule issued here. Previously, employers who failed to provide PPE to covered employees could be issued just a single citation for the aggregate offense only. Historically, over the past 12 years or so, the per employee citation has really only been applied in egregious situations. So it's not something that is the de facto rule, I guess you could say, but OSHA uses it under its discretion, but you never want to find yourself in that scenario, especially if they consider the violation egregious. And we just have a quick example of a case in which the per employee citations were assessed, and this was back around the time that the final rule came out. There was a significant enforcement actions against Rocorp Inc., and there was approximately 15 per instance or per employee PPE violations that amounted to close to $784,000 in initial civil penalties, and they were all related to failing to provide the correct PPE, failing to provide training, and the failure to properly fit test employees for respirators. So as you can see, the initial total penalty there was somewhere, it was $1,277,000, and the PPE related citations made up almost 65–70% of that total penalty. And again, this was an egregious case. All of those per instance, per employee violations were deemed willful. So that is how they got to such a high initial civil penalty of $784,000. And this isn't, intended to scare you, but it is certainly something that is different from some of the other OSHA citations in that regulations in that there is a final rule that specifically allows for these per employee citations. So that is something to keep in mind, and certainly one of the top 5 reasons why you definitely want to get the PPE standard right. So I'm going to turn it back.
Dan, and I'll just jump, this is Aaron, I'll just jump in real quickly. Just point out to everyone that these were citations that were issued under the old penalty structure when the max fine for a willful was $70,000. So now that we're inching close to $140,000, you can imagine the potential penalty. It could have been almost double for this employer, and extrapolate beyond that, if they had found 50 employees not wearing the right PPE, what sort of fine you could be looking at.
Yeah, excellent point.
All right, so for our last reason we want to give you to talk about why you should prioritize PPE and try to get it right is it's the last line of defense. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the hierarchy of controls. You know, the goal is to eliminate hazards, to get them out of the workplace as much as possible, or to remove employees from the zone of danger if you can. But of course, we can't do that for all hazards. We can't completely eliminate the hazard and still run a business. We can't remove employees from the workplace entirely, though we've all had to try a little bit with COVID. There's still going to be some amount of danger that employees need to be protected from in order to do the jobs. And as you can see with this diagram, where you land is PPE. It's important to get PPE right, because if you don't, it is often the last thing standing between you and an employee injury. It's of course the right thing to do to protect your employees, but as we move to the next slide, you can see that it's also important because employee injuries will lead to OSHA inspections, and of course you can't have an OSHA fine without having an OSHA inspection. So we wanted to highlight here what are OSHA's inspection priorities. You can find this on OSHA's website. It's no secret that OSHA has limited inspection resources. They have to cover, the entire country, millions of workplaces with only a few thousand inspectors. So what they do is they try to get the most bang for their buck. They try to increase safety for the greatest number of employees as they can, and they do it by using these inspection priorities. If they learn of an imminent danger situation, they will do an inspection. They'll come out there. If there are severe injuries and illnesses or worker complaints, those are high on the list of reasons that they're going to go out and do an inspection. Now, as you can imagine, having an employee injured because PPE failed or the wrong PPE was provided or anything along those lines, that's going to fit you right here into these top three categories. You can see that getting PPE wrong can put you high on the list of OSHA's inspection priorities. So it's really important because of the proximity of employees to hazards when you're working with PPE, when you're relying on that. It's important to get it right, because having a PPE issue, whether there's an injury or not, even if it's just an employee complaint, that's going to trigger one of these inspection priorities very frequently. So that leads you directly to all of the citations that Dan was talking about earlier, so it's important to get this right. With that, we're going to move on from the reasons of why you should get it right to cover the 5 most common PPE mistakes that we've got. And I'll kick this off talking about the first one here, which is going to be PPE assessments. All right, as I discussed earlier, this is your entree to PPE. OSHA doesn't have a standard that says when you work on X grinder, you need Y kind of PPE. The standards just aren't that specific. These the PPE sections are written as performance standards. Generally speaking, you're supposed to go out, find the hazards, identify the best way to deal with them, and then OSHA will come in later on if they do an inspection and see if you got it right. So you're going to set yourself up for success or failure with your PPE assessment. Now, as we've identified here, there are a lot of ways to mess up a PPE assessment. And you can see all of the different citations that can be issued. The first mistake you can make there is just not doing an assessment, right? If you have workers out there in some workspace doing a task for which you've never done an assessment, you've got significant risk out there from a regulatory perspective. It may be that you haven't done a hazard assessment, and then there may be no hazards. But until you've done it, you can't show that, you can't be certain that there are no hazards, and OSHA can cite you simply for not having done the assessment, even if they're working in a place that's entirely safe. So step one, make sure you do an assessment. You'll avoid those 267 citations we listed there. Step number two, once you've done it, make sure you write it down. Make sure you certify that an assessment was done. That's a requirement there in 1910-132-D2 that you certify that it was done. All right, so we'll have a slide here in just a minute that will show some of the elements of one way that you can do a PPE certification. But make sure that you not only do the assessment, but that you certify that it was done. Make sure you get that in writing. Make sure that you keep that readily accessible, because if there's an inspection and it relates to PPE, you will be asked for it. Now, we had a question pop up from one of the participants here related to PPE assessments and the idea of renewing them. How often do you have to do them? Well, the standard requires that you do a PPE assessment and that you certify it, but it doesn't mention that it has to be renewed or when it has to be renewed. So there is no specific answer to that question. What we tell people is you should be familiar enough with your workplace to know how often things change. If you are constantly reconfiguring operations, if new machines are being added, if new chemicals are being added constantly, you're going to need to renew or refresh, review your PPE hazard assessments pretty frequently. If, on the other hand, you have a well-established manufacturing process or a well-established work site that doesn't change very much, you may find that you could put yourself on a multi-year cycle for renewing or updating those hazard assessments. So as we say with regard to most things related to OSHA, particularly when we have a performance standard like this one, is, if OSHA doesn't tell you how frequently to do something, you just need to make a decision, one that you're comfortable with and one that you're going to be able to defend to the agency. So make sure you do the right thing, make sure you understand why you did it, and you'll be well positioned to defend yourself to the agency if there's ever a question about not having renewed things or updated things often enough. All right, moving on to the next slide. I'll show you the hazard assessment in just one second, but it's important to remember when you're doing this hazard assessment that you match your PPE to the different hazards. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach to PPE. You can imagine, you probably know, there's not one kind of glove in the world. There's probably hundreds or thousands of different kinds of gloves. So when you go out and you identify that there is a hazard for your employees' hands, you've got to figure out what that hazard looks like. What are the injuries that your employees are going to be subjected to, and what PPE is available, not only to protect them, but what PPE is available that will actually let them still do their jobs. So you're going to be in this hazard analysis and in certification, you're going to be matching the hazard to the PPE that you're going to be provided. Now, before we get to the certification itself, it's important to remember the elements that need to be included. You've got to make sure that you note on there the workplace evaluated, person who's certified that the evaluation has been performed, the date, and make sure that it clearly identifies that it is a certification of hazard assessment. I can't tell you how many times I've had a good document that shows that there was some kind of assessment done, but if we don't know who did it or what the date is, or if it doesn't have the word certify on there, you're going to have a hard time convincing an OSHA compliance officer that this is the document that it satisfies the requirements of the standard. So these are very minor paperwork related things on this slide, but it's really important later on so that you can defend yourself if this comes up. All right, moving on to the next slide. This is an example of a very simplified way of doing a hazard assessment. There are as many workplaces as there are in the country. There are probably that many different ways of doing a hazard assessment. What this shows is a hazard assessment broken down by job task. You may find that you have 5 different categories of employees, and so they all do 1 or 2 jobs that are similar, and then they each have 3 or 4 jobs that they do on their own. If you segregate this out by job task, as shown here, it's going to allow you to make this somewhat modular, right? If loading boxes in the back of a truck is a job that all jobs do, great. You can have this here. You can identify what's the PPE that you need for that. On the other hand, welding is probably something that you're not going to have every employee doing. So if you identify a job task of welding or welding in certain circumstances, that will allow you to identify the hazards specific to that job. And then later on, sometimes people will set this up as a matrix. Sometimes they'll just have different PPE requirement sheets for each job category. But basically, it allows you to take information from this and either personalize it or at least make it specific enough to each job category. So, like I said, there's a million different ways of doing this, but this shows one way of doing it. You can see that we've got here on this this document, you've got a space for identifying the person who did the hazard assessment. You've got a signature, you've got a date. We actually don't have the word certify on here. That wouldn't be a bad thing to add to make sure that you OSHA believes that this is your PPE, your certification for your workplace. But this is one example, and of course, it's up to you to match something to your workplace that will make sense. With that, I'll hand it over, I believe, to Aaron for mistake number 2.
Thanks, Micah. And just to follow on what Micah was talking about, that template that he was just talking about was one that one employer has been created and used for specific tasks related to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is kind of why you see some of the types of PPE that might be a little bit different than what you'd normally see in a general industry workplace, the gowns and things along those lines. I did see a question that came in while Micah was talking about assessments, asking who certifies it, OSHA or the employer. So it is the employer. I know certification sounds like a very formal thing, that as if you're submitting this form to OSHA for them to certify that it's correct, but it's really just a fancy way of saying that the person who did it signed and signed off on it as that they've certified that it was done. And it's similar, as Micah said. This is just one of those paperwork citations or paperwork issues or requirements that is just so easy to overlook, as you can see from the number of times that this has been cited in the past year. It's similar in some ways, at least from my perspective, to the requirement with respect to the power industrial truck standards that requires you to certify that the operators have been reassessed every 3 years. It's often that these assessments, that those evaluations are done, but that someone just forgets to create the document to prove that it was done. So that's really kind of the worst possible thing in some ways, to have done the work but not get credit for it from the agency when they come to do an inspection. So the number 2, second most common mistake in terms of the number of times that we've seen it, citations are issued to employers, deals with training. And this is another example of something that just need to make sure that it's getting done. So you can see the most common citation just under 1910-132 F1, which at least to me suggests that it's employers that simply did not do training. At least, or the agency just thought that's the area office that was issuing the citations figured the training program was sufficiently inadequate. We're just going to cite you under F1 for not doing training. It's been kind of similar to a 147 C1 citation under lockout tagout for not having a lockout tagout program. If you then look at the other types of citations that have been issued, and surprisingly, at least to me, there haven't been very many. As you can see, we're really in the single digits, specific aspects of various employer training programs that were deemed inadequate during the course of an inspection. So failing to train under F1I for when PPE is necessary, failing to train under F1.2 for what types of PPE is necessary, and then F1.3, failing to train for how to don, put on, doff, take off, adjust, or wear the PPE. I would have expected that one to be the most commonly cited. I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason to the fact that all three of those were cited 8 times in the past year. Again, a surprisingly low number for me. I don't know if that's the same employer that their program was so defective that OSHA kind of broke it out into separate citations. But you just kind of step back and think about what your goal should be. Obviously, when you're training employees, you've gone through the assessment process that Mike has talked about. You've evaluated either by job or by area or equipment. You've determined what hazards there are. You've determined what types of PPE should be provided, and you've gone out, you've sourced it, you purchased it, and you're now providing it to employees. So you really think, particularly if think about a new employee coming into your workplace. You need to make sure that they understand why it's necessary that they're wearing this, what types that they're expected to wear. Obviously, that they understand how to put it on, how to take it off, how to adjust it, how it should be worn, when it's what its limitations are, as you can see under F1.4. Those are all kind of very basic elements of what would be an effective training program. So moving on to the next slide, still talking about the training piece. Obviously, you also have to train your employees on the proper care and maintenance, if it's, as long as it's not some sort of PPE. Certain of masks, at least in healthcare, OSHA expects them to be changed out regularly, but if for most other types of PPE that your employees are going to be wearing day in and day out, how is it stored, how is it cleaned, things along those lines. And kind of tying to one of the questions that we got, and Micah addressed a little bit earlier, in terms of, while the standard does not address the frequency with which you need to do assessments or reassessments, this section of the standard does talk about when you need to retrain your employees. So, and obviously I think it makes intuitive sense. If you make changes to your workplace that make the prior training obsolete, so somehow either the PPE is going to be used differently, you're going to be providing different types of PPE. In other words, basically you've had to do a new assessment, new decisions have been made, changes or decisions have made decisions about changes that need to be made. Now you need to train the people because that prior training was obsolete. Also, and I think this is probably one of the ones that could be most difficult to spot, but certainly if you do notice that using the way that it's supposed to be used, if they're unable to explain or understand based on discussions that you've had with them, perhaps they've forgotten, they haven't retained the knowledge and skills, the training that they got a year, 2, 3 years ago, then you need to think of times where clients come to us and to describing an OSHA inspection that didn't go well. And whether it's, again, lockout, tagout, where the employee couldn't demonstrate how to lock out the piece of equipment on which they've been trained. For an authorized employee, they can't do that. Same thing, if the COSHA is walking through your workplace, doing those stop and chats with various employees working on the line, and it starts asking about PPE, or sees somebody who's not wearing their PPE correctly, we all, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that that surgical masks and face coverings are not truly PPE, but you see people walking down the street that have their mask on and it's not covering their nose, or it's under their chin or something like that. That sort of improper wearing of PPE would be something that would presumably prompt you to retrain that employee so they understand the purpose of that PPE and how it should be worn. So I think I think we're turning it back to Dan to talk about mistake number 3.
Yep, and just one thing to add about the training piece, outside of the general framework that you have under 1910-132, it's also important to keep in mind that those additional specific training requirements that might be under a particular regulation, for example, the respiratory protection standard has those specific training requirements that you'll also want to take a close look at as well. And there's other more specific training requirements under several different PPE related standards. So just one note about that is don't focus solely on 1910-132, but there also may be other regulations at play that you need to take into consideration. Moving on to mistake number 3, and this falls under that general 1910-132A, the general application section. And I had mentioned this earlier. This is, for not providing adequate PPE, not using adequate PPE, or not providing PPE at all, not providing it in a sanitary condition. There's a number of different ways that you can find yourself falling under this provision. And as you can see on the slide here, the bold font is really the primary language that you want to be focusing on. The PPE shall be provided, used, and maintained in a sanitary and reliable condition whenever it is necessary. So there's a lot of language, broad language that OSHA has at their disposal under this regulation. And as you can see, it was cited 173 times in the past fiscal year. And if you are cited under this provision, this broad application provision, there's probably going to be some corollary and associated citations along with it, falling under either the training provision in 1910-132F or 132D, the hazard assessment and equipment selection regulations that Aaron and Micah just went over the previous couple slides. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to go over case number 4 to Micah.
All right, so I mentioned earlier that one of the requirements of the PPE standard is that the employer pays for PPE, and if you just keep that in mind, you'll be right 98% of the time. But there are a few circumstances where you do not. So we'll talk about the exceptions rather than the rule. So just remember the rule: always pay for PPE unless you meet one of these exceptions. So some things that aren't PPE. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when it becomes COVID specific in a minute, but generally you're not required to pay for everyday clothing, ordinary clothing, even if it is uniform based, even if it is somehow related to employee protection. So let's say you have workers outside, and in order to protect them from the sun, you require long sleeves. Well, that's not the kind of specialty PPE that the standard requires you to pay for. The same is true for things like raincoats, sunglasses, and sunscreen. Those are important not just for employee comfort, but also at some level for employee safety, particularly for sun safety. So if it fits into the ordinary clothing category, you're not going to have to pay for that. One wrinkle that sometimes trips people up is, well, what if it's a very specific type of ordinary clothing? So you may require employees to wear 100% cotton clothing because there's a fire risk. The answer to that is for that ordinary clothing, even if it has to be very specific in order to meet the job requirements, you still are not required to pay for that. So on the other hand, if you're going to require someone to wear fire retardant coveralls over 100% cotton clothing, you can see where you're going to draw the line on what you have to pay for, what you don't. You will have to pay for that fire retardant set of coveralls, but you won't have to pay for the 100% cotton clothing underneath. So it can be a little bit tricky finding those lines, but just remember, ordinary clothing is not something you have to pay for. Very specific PPE to protect employees, that's what you are going to have to pay for. All right, there's a few other very specific exemptions here. Logging boots. If you have employees who do logging, you're not going to have to pay for that. Another one that we run into frequently is for non-specialty safety toe protective footwear. So if you, and the distinction here between what you have to pay for and what you don't have to pay for is going to be whether the employees are required to leave those at work or whether they are allowed to take them home for their own personal use. even though safety toe footwear does fit under the definition of PPE, you do not have to pay for it for your employees if your employees are allowed to wear it off-site for their own personal use. On the other hand, if you require them to keep it there, if they're not allowed to use it for personal use, that fits into the category of things that you're going to have to pay for. There's a little blurb here about metatarsal guards. It's a kind of a funky thing there related to safety toe footwear. If you're providing external metatarsal guards, but your employee wants to wear protective footwear that has metatarsal guards built into the shoe as part of the shoe, you're not required to pay for that, because that gets down to an employee preference. They would rather use this kind of PPE rather than the one that you're providing. For that reason, you're not required to pay for the type that they prefer. Now, you've got to be careful if the let's say the external metatarsal guards that you're providing won't fit them, won't provide them adequate protection. That's going to be a different situation. But if it's just a pure matter of preference, that's where you're going to see that you're not going to have to pay for their preference. And that leads us to the last bullet point on this slide here. It's where an employee provides their own protective equipment. If there is something that they prefer, if they already own their own PPE from another job or from their own work, you're not required to reimburse them if they bring their own PPE to the job. Now, with that said, you are required to ensure that the PPE that they bring is adequately protective. So you have to make sure, if you're going to allow them to bring in their own PPE, you've got to make sure that it works, that it meets the criteria that you've established. If you require shoes that are built to a certain ANSI standard, you've got to check and make sure that you can verify that they meet that ANSI standard. So you can get into some tricky situations trying to accommodate employee preferences. We can't really cover them all here because they are very fact specific, but general rule there is you don't have to pay for PPE if it is entirely focused on the employee's preference, so long as you are offering to pay for the PPE that is required in order for them to work safely. And with that, we'll move on to the last mistake number 5 that's often made, and that's relying on PPE when other controls are available. We talked before about, the reasons you need to, PPE is important, is the last line of defense on the hierarchy of controls. We also see employers run into problems when they jump to PPE too quickly. You will often, sometimes you'll get cited under the PPE standard, sometimes you'll get cited under a machine guarding standard. But many employers will see a hazard. There will be an engineering way to fix that. There will be some options to fix it, but it's just much easier to throw employees in gloves, in protective footwear, something like that. And so we included this mistake here just as a caution that even though we're focusing this webinar on PPE, don't forget there are lots of other protective measures that are out there, and it is preferable to use them, not just because of the hierarchy of controls, but also because PPE, as we discussed earlier, it's a collaborative element for employees and employers. Not only do you have to provide it, the employees have to wear it. So if you are able to use other protective mechanisms rather than PPE, you may be able to avoid a lot of citations that you might get related to improper use or improper training, things along those lines. And the last element here is if you are seeing potential challenges with employees improperly using PPE, just know that if you're facing an OSHA inspection and there is improper PPE usage going on, and you try to argue with OSHA that you shouldn't be responsible because it's employee misconduct, there's going to be a lot of time and energy devoted to evaluating the training and the discipline that you're performing there in the work site. So this is just a note of caution that if you can avoid PPE by eliminating or otherwise removing employees from the zone of danger for hazards, it's often easier, more reliable, a little bit more sure than going the PPE route. So. All right, with that, we will shift over to, I think, the COVID-19 specific part of this presentation. So I'll pass it back over to Aaron.
Thanks, Micah. And interestingly enough, I've spent much of the last 3 months responding to more COVID-19 OSHA complaints than I can count at this point. And an overwhelming majority of them are either focused almost entirely on the alleged lack of PPE, misunderstandings about the type of PPE that has been provided. And why I think it's so interesting is Micah has talked about the hierarchy of controls. OSHA recommends and expects employers to follow the same hierarchy in doing your workplace assessments and deciding what measures you're going to adopt to protect your employees from COVID. And just as Micah said, PPE is with respect to the pandemic, as with respect to any other workplace hazard, is really the last line of defense. And so it's just the odd aspect to me is that employees, and probably because it is by definition, it's personal. So it's the protective measure that they have they're closest to. They're wearing it. So without it, they don't feel safe, even though there are a host of other measures, whether they're safe work practices, administrative controls, engineering controls, or hazard elimination, that are far better. Obviously, if I can work from home, I don't need any PPE to keep me safe from the workplace because I'm not there. If there are safe work practices, if there are other measures that put in place, those are deemed superior to OSHA. But really, if you put yourself in your employees' positions, understand that many of them are looking for and perhaps wondering why they're not given or provided a certain type of PPE. So that kind of gets to one of the things that we keep talking about throughout this pandemic is the importance of communication. And this kind of gets, again, back to the training and talking about why, and making sure employees understand why they're being given certain types of PPE or perhaps why not. So moving to the first slide, and for those of you, we've been doing lots of OSHA COVID-focused OSHA webinars for the past 3 months. So for those of you that have joined us for past ones, you may have seen some of these slides in the past, so I won't spend too much time on them. But you know, kind of the world began with respect to OSHA's view as to this pandemic in early March when the agency issued this guidance you see here, the cover page issued on March 9th of this year. And throughout this whole process, OSHA really is I don't want to say deferring, but directing employees towards the CDC. There's a ton of information on the CDC's website. OSHA, at the same time, is issuing significant numbers of guidance documents focused on various industry types. But if you are following the CDC's guidance, and note also that guidance, obviously, for those of you that have been tracking, it changes. It's changing quite often. And I've been speaking to a number of OSHA officials here in Region 5. They are tracking when it changes. So they're basically logging or keeping track of when the CDC's guidance was modified with the purpose of being able to evaluate whether an employer was complying with or following the guidance that was in existence at the time of a specific complaint. So they are really kind of focusing on that aspect. Within OSHA's guidance, they've basically divided the workplace or workplaces into a series of risk exposure levels, and then tie to those different levels of risk the steps that the agency recommends, and really that an employer in good faith would be taking. It's not prescriptive. Just like Mike and Dan were talking about, the types of PPE are not specifically laid out for every task, but the agency expects you to engage in an analysis to determine what types of protective measures are necessary, whether it's PPE or other types. So moving on to the next slide, the categories that OSHA has identified, for the most part, if you look on the left-hand side here, the very high risk and high risk are really almost exclusively limited to the healthcare and death care industries. So very high being folks that are caring for known or suspected COVID patients, ward workers that are autopsying bodies of known or suspected COVID patients, And then high being healthcare support, so that could be medical transport. It could be the people that bathe or care for known or suspected COVID patients, and then also, again, the death care industry, mortuary workers who are preparing bodies of known or suspected COVID patients, burial, but not conducting actual autopsy. The rest of the world fits into the right-hand column, so the medium risk and lower risk categories. And the medium risk is a kind of an amalgamation of those workplaces where your employees have regular exposure to third parties, members of the public. So obviously folks that work in retail settings, grocery stores, now as restaurants reopen, where they're going to be coming into contact frequently, if not throughout their shift, with people who you don't know. Whether or not that person is obviously infectious or not. The other part within the medium category would be people working in those areas where there is a high incidence of COVID transmission, community spread. So I sit here in Chicago, where we're one of the I guess the real hot spots continue to be, although things are finally starting to improve. A manufacturing workplace in most parts of the country would fall into the lower category because it's a closed place. You don't have members of the public coming in. But if you place that manufacturing site in Cook County, Chicago or the surrounding Cook County, then you very well may fall into the medium risk category, meaning that you would need to have more measures in place if that factory is in Chicago than if that factory is in rural Illinois or rural Arkansas or somewhere else in the country. Moving to the next slide, which is, again, this is following the hierarchy of controls, the types of protective measures to consider to keep your employees safe during the pandemic. We don't include it at the top, again, which would be elimination of the hazard. So those employees that can work from home, send them home. Those employees that don't need to come to the workplace every day, limit the amount of time that they're in the workplace. Then looking at those permanent measures that don't rely on employee kind of interaction or input, so engineering controls, changing the ventilation rates, installing physical barriers such as sneeze guards. If anyone's been shopping in the past 3 months, presumably you've seen them at the checkout counters, you've seen them in the pharmacies. I recently was doing a webinar with an industrial hygiene expert who shared an interesting point about ventilation rates. One of his recommendations is if you've got a system that cycles off, when people finish work, if you have a single shift and people generally leave at 5, generally that system is going to shut down shortly after 5. He recommends changing your settings so it continues cycling in fresh air or cycling out older air for several hours after the shift ends, as well as several hours before the shift begins. Moving down from engineering controls to then administrative controls. So these are ways that your policies that you're adopting, changing your shifts. So fewer people are coming to work at the same time. You're allowing people you're having virtual meetings. You're changing travel. Obviously, you're adopting an SOP, a standard operating procedure or protocols for requiring sick people to come home. I can tell you with respect to these types of things, when OSHA does inspections, whether it's in response to a COVID fatality or in response to a complaint, written policies, SOPs are very helpful. And in those cases where I've dealt with complaints where OSHA has asked for follow-up information, that's one of the more common requests. Like, it's great that you're doing X, but is there a written policy or procedure in place that you can show us to confirm that? Same concept with respect to safe work practices, so changing your sanitation protocols, your cleaning schedules. If you've got a written schedule for the cleaning, a checklist that shows that your housekeeping team has actually completed it and turned it in so management can verify it, that's another thing that OSHA loves to see. And then last but not least, obviously today's focus, PPE, is again, it's at the bottom of the hierarchy of controls when it comes to protecting employees during the pandemic. So now we're going to talk about a couple of different aspects of PPE specific to this pandemic. First and foremost, one area where we generally find, I think now it was a little bit uneven during the first month or so of the pandemic, But one area where if you are doing employee screening, so this is kind of one of what I call the main pillars of an effective workplace exposure control plan, is having some sort of screening process. So whether that's self-assessment where employees take their temperature or in essence certifying to you by clocking in that they have checked their temperature, that they are not coughing, that they don't have chest pain. That's one method. Thermal cameras are another method. It's an expensive one, not always the most reliable one, but one that more and more employers seem to be adopting. Neither of those two really involve any sort of potential contact or transmission unless with a self-assessment, somebody is still asking those questions or confirming that the person did it physically and in person. But if you're in your workplaces, you are administering or taking temperatures of employees or whether it's customers or guests at a hotel or something like that, using hopefully a non-contact thermometer, certainly not one that requires contact with each person tested. You need to make sure that the person who is doing that testing is outfitted in the appropriate PPE. And we've seen quite a few cases where that's not happening. Certainly, I think at a minimum, it requires a mask and ideally a face shield. Preferably even an N95 mask, which then implicates a whole host of requirements. If you're mandating that for your test taker or your temperature taker, of having all the elements of a respiratory protection program, there may be engineering controls that you could, in terms of barriers, where you could put the temp taker behind. But you certainly want to make sure that when you are taking temperatures as part of your screening process, if that's part of what you do, that you've really thought through that protections necessary for that person. And just moving on, and I've covered a couple of these in the next slide already, a number of other types of PPE that are obviously common and can be effective with respect to infectious diseases. So goggles and a face shield, as presumably everybody knows, that this virus and other infectious diseases can often be transmitted through the eyes. So having a mask, if someone is going to be working very closely to a coworker, again, or to members of the public, in many instances, it's kind of a belt and suspenders approach of giving them a face covering as well as a face shield. So while you're reducing the amount of the viral load that they may be inhaling, that it's not also then contacting their eyes. This is something particularly that I tend to recommend. If you think about your maintenance team, if you're at a factory or other facility with a maintenance department, in many instances, the members of that team have to work in close quarters, particularly if they're changing out a large piece of equipment or something that requires them to be right next to each other for extended periods of time. A face covering is likely not going to be enough, and you'd want to consider goggles or a face shield. Because so much of this is new, because so many people are wearing PPE for the first time, again, certainly with respect to perhaps even in office environments now, it's vitally important. I talked about training as the second most commonly made mistake. Make sure that you're training people, whether it's the first time they've worn PPE or the first time that they've worn this type of PPE that's related to COVID, so they understand how to put it on, how to take it off, when it needs to be replaced, what are signs that it's no longer effective or it's dirty. And because it's so important to make sure that if you're wearing goggles or some sort of face covering or something along those lines, that not only that they understand how to put it on so it's effective, but also how to take it off so they don't further transmit the virus to themselves that it may be on the PPE that they're wearing. Micah talked about PPE hazard assessments. In many cases, there are a number of new tasks or positions that exist because of this pandemic. That temperature taker, you should have, if it's your employee, you should have a PPE hazard assessment specific for that task that is certified and signed. If you have new sanitation, new chemicals that are being used, make sure that you have the appropriate PPE that's required for them. You've got the safety data sheets that you're training the people. So you not only have PPE requirements, but HAZCOM requirements. And then make sure, obviously, that your management team, particularly your frontline supervisors and managers, understand these new requirements, that they've received appropriate training so they know what to look for with respect to the PPE and be able to spot when people are not wearing what they should be wearing or not wearing it in the appropriate way. So I will turn it over to Dan now to talk a little bit more about goggles, face shields, gloves, masks, and all that fun stuff.
Yep, thanks, Aaron, and we'll hop in quickly here in the interest of time. I know we're a little bit over already, so these next two slides I'll go over briefly because Aaron pretty much covered them for the most part. So goggles and face shields we're talking about here. Goggles form a protective seal around the eyes and prevent objects or droplets from entering around them, and obviously this is something that in probably the majority of workplaces wasn't something that was required under the normal PPE hazard assessment. But again, as Aaron was saying, if you have employees that are standing directly next to each other, this is certainly something that you need to consider. And it's not a one-size-fits-all, right? It can be goggles, it can be face shields. Face shields are a little different. That is recommended as a secondary protector to be used in combination with goggles or additional protection of the whole face. And what that does is it provides a barrier to aerosols and droplets. Protects, you've probably seen them in pictures over the past 3 months. These are face shields have been talked about for quite a bit now. They're easy to don and doff. They're a little easier to wear in comparison to the goggles. Those are uncomfortable if you're using them for a prolonged period of time, and they have a tendency to fog up. The face shield, in contrast, you just plop it on over your forehead basically, and it covers your whole face. And for the most part, these are relatively inexpensive. Note that neither of these are per se required by OSHA. Again, these are things that are developing and new for both employers and OSHA at this point, especially addressing the hazard of COVID-19. So this is really up to you in addressing the hazards in your workplace and finding what PPE suits your workplace best. So moving on to gloves. This is another form of PPE that a lot of employers are providing to employees now. Depending on the work setting, of course, many employers have opted to make gloves available for employees, especially in those work settings where employees are frequently touching the same surfaces or objects. So manufacturing, somewhere in those settings where you're on a line or multiple employees are working at the same workstation. Those are areas where a lot of employers have certainly provided those gloves for employee use and in many cases mandating their use. So this is just basic. These next few bullets here on the glove slide, you want to make sure that they're, of course, covering the entire hand up to the cuff and wrist area. And then when you're removing gloves, this gets into kind of a practical piece and a training piece, which is pretty simple and straightforward, but you want to make sure that they're removing them properly. There's no point in wearing them if you take it off and you're touching the contaminated area during that process. So there's specific instructions, and you can kind of, for the interest of time, I won't go over these specific methods, but the glove and glove or bird beak methods are the safe way to remove gloves where you're not touching any of the potentially contaminated surfaces on the gloves itself. So now this is kind of the most important piece, I would say, and the topic that we've gotten the most questions about, and that's respiratory protection, and whether you as an employer should require employees to wear masks, and if so, what type of masks. There's a lot of different types of masks out there, right? You have the cloth bandanas, the simple paper masks, or DIY masks that you make at home, and then you have, on the other hand, respirators, right? N95 masks and even half face or full face tight fitting respirators. This slide here, we're going to first talk about the CDC guidance and the cloth face coverings. So generally all employers at this point should require the use of some type of face covering in the workplace. That's certainly recommended. And typically we're talking about cloth face coverings. So the CDC lists 5 criteria for those. 1, it needs to fit snug and comfortably against the face, secured with ties or ear loops. Make sure that it is secured around the person's mouth and nose. It should include multiple layers of fabric and allow for breathing without restriction, and able to be laundered or dried without any damage. So an employee who declines to wear any type of mask without any medical or other protected reason, you can prohibit them from coming to work, and they may be disciplined. If you provide this in your policies that employees are required to wear masks pending some type of medical or other protected reason, that is your policy, and you can take adverse action against that. And that's somewhat of the crossover that we get to with the workplace safety and health and employment law issues. And again, this is, we're talking about cloth face coverings. You can require them, and employees can be permitted to use their own face covering. And we're going to get into OSHA's position on what is required, what is PPE, and whether you need to provide and pay for that in just a couple slides here. So here, I guess, taking a step back again, we're talking about a range of different masks, right? So we'll start first with the face covering, the cloth mask or bandana. Under OSHA's current guidance and the FAQs that were recently updated just a little bit ago, such face coverings are not considered PPE, and the employer does not have to pay for them under 1910-132. So that is OSHA's current position. And the same goes for surgical or dental masks. They are not considered PPE if being used only as a source control. In other words, not to protect workers against splashes and sprays. So obviously, if you're in a manufacturing setting, that is going to be the basis, right? You're using surgical or dental masks as a source control. You're not akin to a hospital or a dental office where those types of employers are using them to protect their workers against splashes and sprays, right? So under those circumstances, you do not have to pay for those types of masks, surgical or dental masks, under the PPE standard. Note, however, that OSHA has hinted and taken the position that the General Duty Clause, Section 5A1 of the OSHA Act, may require employers to provide and pay for such masks as they're intended to be worn as a feasible means of abatement in a control plan. So to the extent that you as an employer are requiring masks in the workplace, it is recommended that you do provide and pay for such masks. That's just best practice at this point. Obviously, OSHA is taking a hard look at these respiratory protection issues, and it's ongoing. Again, the FAQs were just updated within the past week or so, and we have seen some action as it relates to enforcement and respiratory protection. So a lot of employees are bringing their own personal masks into the workplace, many of which are considered respirators under 1910-134, and those include N95 masks. So if you as an employer require masks, right, you're typically thinking, okay, employees are going to be wearing the cloth face covering, the bandana or the DIY masks that wrap around your ears, or the dental surgical mask, that type. But what happens if an employee shows up with an N95 mask or some other type of filtering face piece? Or even better yet, what if they show up and they say, oh, I want to wear a tight-fitting half-face respirator or a paper respirator? What do you do then, right? So if we're talking about 1910-134, the respiratory protection standard, if you are requiring that employees wear those surgical or dental masks or the cloth face coverings, that does not implicate any of the employer obligations or responsibilities under the respiratory protection program. If an employee does come in and would like to wear an N95 mask, we have been recommending that employers do allow employees to wear their own personal N95 mask, but with that does come some minor regulatory obligations. You need to provide them Appendix D of 1910-134, and it's best to get them to sign off on that. You can also post a copy of Appendix D in the workplace, but this would be considered voluntary use. So under 1910-34, all that's required is that you provide them Appendix D and make sure that it's worn properly, right? So if someone comes into the workplace and brings one of the half-mask tight-fitting respirators, that is going to implicate a whole new set of requirements, right? If an employee comes in with that and you're allowing them to use that, OSHA is going to take the position that you need a full-blown respiratory protection program, a written respiratory protection program, and there's additional obligations under that, right, including training, fit tests, medical evaluations. So if someone's coming into the workplace and says, I want to wear my full-face respirator, the tight-fitting full-face respirator, half-face respirator, we recommend that you don't allow them to do that, because that's just going to cause a slew of headaches for you as an employer, and it exposes you to significant more OSHA liability in the end. So the only regulatory burden that you might face by allowing the voluntary use of N95s, again, is significantly smaller than if someone's coming in with those full-face respirators. So it's best to keep those out of the workplace. N95s, again, that's a different story. Minor inconvenience, but something that you as an employer can work around, and it appeases employees. And with the N95 shortage, that's still ongoing. It's somewhat difficult to get their hands on those anyway, but it has happened. We've gotten a lot of questions about it. And to save face with employees, it's best just to go ahead and let them voluntarily use those N95s or similar filtering face masks. So just recently, OSHA, within the past month or so, issued some enforcement relief related to respiratory protection. And really, we could have a whole webinar itself on respiratory protection related to COVID-19. So we are slamming this into just a few slides to give you the overview. But again, if you have any questions related to respiratory protection, because this is a big issue, feel free to reach out to us after the webinar here. We're coming up to the end. But a temporary enforcement memoranda was issued that relaxed the enforcement position related to respiratory protection. So there's no annual respirator fit tests that were required, and employers were allowed to, or employees I should say, were allowed to reuse respirators beyond their usual and manufacturer's recommended life. And this was all prompted by the massive shortage of N95 masks, right? These were being siphoned off to the healthcare facilities as a priority, of course, understandably, but that left a lot of employers who traditionally used N95 and other filtering face pieces in their workplace to address hazards that were inherent to the workplace, not solely to address COVID-19. So there was a big problem, right? What type of respirators should we be doing, or how should we respond if we can't get these respirators? Well, OSHA did provide some enforcement relief, and as you see the 3 bullets on there, they did allow for reuse, no respirator fit tests, and that's related to just a social distancing issue and keeping people away from each other. And then they approved non-NIOSH approved N95 respirators that were certified by other countries, and there's a whole list of them in this temporary relief that you can look at to see which types of filtering face pieces are now accepted. So the other piece to this is OSHA will not cite respiratory protection violations if you performed initial fit tests. You reinforce the importance of a fit check for an adequate seal with employees, and then you train employees in the proper storage, cleaning, and inspecting of those respirators. So those are really general requirements under the respiratory protection standard anyway. If N95s or other filtering face pieces are required at your workplace to address hazards inherent in the workplace, that is, of course, going to require the written program, training, fit test, medical evaluation, all that anyway. So this is a good time, if you haven't already, to take a close, hard look at your respiratory protection program if you have one. and make sure that that's up to date and all your employees are complying with it. And then on the other hand, if you're new to the respiratory protection standard and employer obligations therein, know that with employees coming into the workplace, say it's an office or a grocery store, a manufacturing setting where respirators aren't normally used, you may find yourself in a situation where an employee does come to the workplace with a respirator, and you want to be prepared to address that and know how to handle it in the first instance to avoid any OSHA issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron to wrap up, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, and I would just second what Dan is recommending with respect to potentially having to adopt a respiratory protection program kind of on the fly, if you will, with this relaxed enforcement guidance. OSHA is a bit more understanding, but there are, again, those elements that they are still going to expect to see. So when they relax the annual fit testing requirement, they have not done away with the initial fit testing requirement. There are vendors out there that are still doing that initial fit testing. There are ways to do most of the medical evaluation process online. There are vendors that we can help you all source with that process as well, putting together a program. We've worked with, as you might imagine, a number of employers that have adopted these programs on the fly. So if that's something that you all are struggling with, just give any one of us a call. So again, thank you for joining us. As you can see on the slide, check out our blog, our OSHA blog, OSHADefenseReport.com. We are regularly posting articles, primarily but not exclusively, dealing with the pandemic. We'll continue to do webinars for the rest of the year, so check out our webinar calendar as well. Our next webinar will be in July and every month thereafter. And again, everyone stay safe and be well. Thank you.